The sound of luxury car engines reached Clara even before she crossed the immense gate of the mansion. Inside, laughter echoed through the corridors decorated with expensive chandeliers and tables laden with crystal goblets. The party was in full swing, and no one imagined that. At that very moment, an ordinary woman like Clara was about to transform that night. The invitations to that party were exclusive. Only members of high society, children of businessmen and heirs to fortunes were invited. Mason, Luke, and Logan, known at university for their arrogance and wealth, had been planning this party for months. For them, it was the perfect stage to display their power. Mason, in particular, had a cruel plan in mind: to publicly humiliate Clara, live streaming everything on social media. Inviting her was merely a piece of the game, a prank. They knew she would never be able to mingle with the elite and expected the night to be a spectacle of her shame. Clara, however, was not just any player. Dressed in a simple yet elegant dress that highlighted her confidence, she arrived accompanied by Julian. Her companion exuded a mysterious aura, with his impeccable suit and composed demeanor. At first glance, no one recognized them. It wasn't uncommon for outsiders to appear with some strange connection, and everyone assumed Julian was just another guest. However, soon the eyes began to fix on them. The conversations that followed Clara and Julian's appearance were not filled with disdain, but rather curiosity. Something in the air indicated that things would not go as Mason had planned. Mason, from a distance, watched with a cynical smile on his face. He was just waiting for the right moment. He knew the cameras were positioned in strategic locations, ready to capture the moment Clara got lost in that world of luxury. Humiliation was on its way, he thought. But there was something he had not foreseen. Clara held her head high, as if she were already familiar with that environment. She seemed to move with an unexpected confidence, and Julian's mystery beside her left no room for weakness. "Who is she?" someone whispered as they passed by Clara and Julian. "I have no idea, but they seem to belong here." Mason began to feel discomfort grow. He had underestimated her presence. Trying to regain control of the situation, he approached them, with Luke and Logan right behind him. The three had the typical look of those who considered themselves the owners of the space. They circled closer like predators stalking their prey, ready to initiate the game. Mason was the first to speak. "Clara, I didn't expect you to come. You seem to have made quite an effort to be here." Clara did not flinch. She gave Mason a firm look and with a slight smile replied, "Not as much as you did to organize all this." Her calm voice destabilized Mason for a moment. He had not anticipated such a direct response. He was used to seeing people tremble before him, especially when he prepared some type of humiliation. Luke and Logan chuckled quietly, but the discomfort was palpable. Julian, who had been quiet until then, intervened with a calm yet firm demeanor. "Is this the party you organized, Mason? I expected something more impressive. I don't understand how someone can spend so much money to gather such mediocre people." The phrase hit like a bomb. Mason tried to contain his shock but couldn't help the rigidity that seized his body. Who was this man daring to speak like that? He felt control of the situation slipping through his fingers. With a forced laugh, he retorted, "And who do you think you are to speak like that? Do you think you can just show up here and—" "I am Julian DuPont," Julian interrupted with calmness, but his voice cut like a sharp blade. "And I believe your father has probably heard of me." The name Julian echoed in Mason's ears like a blow. DuPont, the most powerful investor in Europe, the one who could, with a simple decision, bring entire businesses down or turn them into empires. That name was not just some random unknown. It was a legend in the business world. And now, the man behind that name was standing there, next to Clara. Mason felt the ground slip from under his feet, but his arrogance did not allow him to back down immediately. "What are you doing here, DuPont?" He tried to maintain a superior tone, but his voice faltered slightly. Julian merely smiled with an irritating calmness. "I came to accompany Clara. I thought it would be interesting to see how you behave when you're on your own, without your parents to save you." Luke and Logan exchanged nervous glances. They also knew the name DuPont, and Julian's presence at the party left them completely lost. The plan to humiliate Clara was quickly crumbling, and they no longer had control over anything. Mason felt the weight of the name. Julian DuPont crush his confidence. For a moment, the confident expression he always wore was replaced by a mix of uncertainty and embarrassment. The smiles of Luke and Logan faded, replaced by uncomfortable glances. The humiliation they had planned was starting to turn against them. The tense silence around them was broken only by the murmurs of the other guests, who were now paying more attention to the group's interaction. Mason tried to regain control. "So, are you just here to observe?" His attempt to sound casual failed miserably. Julian, always calm, stepped forward, keeping his gaze fixed on Mason. "Not exactly. I'm here to ensure that certain injustices don't happen tonight." His tone was firm, but there was a calculated softness, a veiled threat that Mason couldn't ignore. Clara stood beside Julian, her posture calm. Her strength lay in her quiet confidence. Contrary to what Mason expected, she wasn't there to beg for acceptance or be humiliated. She knew her worth and didn't need to prove anything to anyone. The trio's plan was beginning to unravel, and the situation was becoming increasingly out of Mason's control. "I don't understand," Mason continued, desperately trying to find a way to maintain his position of superiority. "Why would someone like you care about her?" He gestured dismissively at Clara, trying to diminish her presence. Julian tilted his head slightly, a mysterious smile on his face. "You think you know everything, don't you, Mason? So convinced that money can buy respect, admiration, even dignity. But the truth is, in this world, there are things you don't understand. Clara is one of those things." Mason tried to laugh, but the sound came out weak and insecure. Luke and Logan stood behind him, waiting for him to do something to regain control. But for the first time, Mason was at a loss for words. He had underestimated Clara and Julian, and now he was tasting the bitter fruit of his own pride. "I still don't see what makes her so special," Mason murmured, but his voice no longer carried the same arrogance. He was retreating. Clara finally spoke up, her voice serene but laden with inner strength. "You don't need to see, Mason. That's your problem. You think everything should revolve around you and your limited worldview. But what you never understood is that it's not material possessions, luxury, or social status that define someone. It's the choices. And today, you're about to reap the consequences of yours." Mason, surprised by her firmness, took a step back. What he had planned to be a moment of public humiliation for Clara was now turning into a stage for his own ruin. The tension between them was almost unbearable. He looked around, realizing that all the guests were watching that interaction, waiting for his next move. Luke, restless, whispered something in his ear, suggesting that perhaps it was time to back down. But Mason, unable to accept defeat so easily, decided to raise the stakes. He raised his voice, trying to regain the audience around him. "So you think you can come here, throw words around, and pretend you have some sort of power over us?" Julian gave a slight smile, as if he had already anticipated this moment. "Power, Mason, isn't something that can be faked. Either you have it, or you don't." At that moment, Mason's phone vibrated in his pocket. He ignored it for a second, trying to keep his focus on Julian and Clara, but the persistent vibration continued. Annoyed, he pulled out the device. His eyes narrowed upon seeing his father's name on the screen. Answering quickly, his expression went from irritated to pale in seconds. "Dad?" Mason's voice sounded distant as he listened to the words on the other end of the line. His hand began to tremble slightly. "What do you mean?" "No, this can't be happening." The guests around began to notice the abrupt change in Mason's behavior. Luke and Logan moved closer, concerned, trying to understand what was happening. Mason hung up the phone, his eyes fixed on Julian as if he were responsible for it all. But deep down, he knew he was reaping the consequences of his own actions. Julian crossed his arms, calm. "It seems things aren't going very well for your family, Mason. Maybe this is the moment for you to rethink how you act with people. Not everything can be bought or manipulated." Mason opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. For the first time, he was faced with a situation where money and status couldn't save him. He felt control slipping completely from his hands. Luke and Logan, who always followed him blindly, now seemed confused and restless, as if they didn't know what to do without Mason's orders. Clara watched it all calmly. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to do anything for the truth to be revealed. Her presence, standing there next to Julian, was enough to collapse the house of cards that Mason had built. Luke and Logan exchanged glances, restless, unsure of how to act. They had always followed Mason blindly, confident that he controlled every situation. But now, in front of Julian and Clara, with Mason visibly shaken, their confidence crumbled as well. Luke, the most impulsive of the three, stepped forward, trying to regain some of the lost arrogance. "This isn't going to end like this," Luke said, his voice wavering slightly. "You may be whoever you are, but you have no right to come here and try to humiliate us like this." Julian calmly turned to him, as if observing an insignificant problem, and replied with a chilling tranquility. "I'm not trying to humiliate anyone. You did that all on your own." Julian's words hit Luke and Logan hard. That was exactly what was happening. Their arrogance, their attempt to destroy someone for fun, was now turning against them. The glares of contempt that Clara should have received were now directed at the trio. The people at the party began to whisper, and Luke and Logan could feel the weight of the judgments. The plan that had seemed perfect in their heads was crumbling. Mason, still in shock from the phone call, could barely think. Everything he had built, his image, his pride, the control he exerted over everyone around him, was disappearing before his eyes. He felt as if his life was slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do about it. "Is this some kind of game for you?" Mason finally spoke, his voice trembling. "You came here just to destroy everything we have?" Julian smiled to the side, but his expression was laden with a cold seriousness. "Do you really think I would bother wasting time on something as insignificant as your ego games? The only thing I'm doing here is bringing clarity. You buried yourselves." Clara watched in silence. There was a calmness in her gaze, but it was not complacency. It was the result of years of listening to the same arrogant speeches, dealing with people like Mason who thought the world revolved around them. She didn't need to say much. Julian was doing that for her, but her presence was enough to show Mason that he had lost. "You're saying that now, but you're no different from us," Logan shouted, desperately trying to find some semblance of control. "You hide behind your money and power just like we do. Don't pretend to be better." Julian, impassive, looked at Logan for a moment before responding, his voice low but carrying an unwavering strength. "The difference is that I don't use my power to destroy lives for fun. You had the chance to build something, to do something meaningful, but you chose the easier path of cruelty. And now you're reaping what you sowed." The room was silent, each of Julian's words heavy in the air. Luke and Logan, who had always relied on Mason to dictate the direction of things, were completely lost. Their confidence, built on arrogance and money, was disintegrating before their eyes. The guests around them watched, some shocked, others satisfied to see the trio finally exposed. Mason, however, couldn't accept it. He couldn't admit that, for once in his life, he was on the wrong side. The pride that had sustained him for so many years was now making him stumble in his own downfall. He stepped forward, trying to compose himself, his breath quickening. "This isn't over. You may have done what you did today, but I'm still here. I still have power, and I will rise again." Julian stared at him for a long moment, then, with his usual calmness, delivered the final blow. "Your father thought he had power too, until his company fell. What do you think will happen now that this information spreads?" Mason felt the impact of those words like a punch to the stomach. He knew something was wrong when he received the phone call, but he hadn't expected Julian to be involved. Everything started to make sense now. The reason Julian was there, the way he controlled the situation. It was as if everything had been meticulously planned, and Mason was the only one who hadn't noticed. You did this?" Mason's voice was low, almost inaudible. "You destroyed my family?" Julian took a step forward, reducing the distance between them. "Me? No. Your family destroyed itself, just like you are doing now." Julian's words were a verdict. The truth was harsh, undeniable. There was nowhere for Mason to run. The fortune, power, and prestige that had always protected him were evaporating. The trio, who had always united around money and arrogance, now found themselves alone, surrounded by people observing their downfall with curiosity and disdain. Clara, who had remained silent all this time, stepped forward toward Mason. She looked him in the eyes, and for a moment, he almost saw a glimmer of compassion in her gaze. But then she spoke with a calmness that only someone who had overcome their own battles could possess. "You invited me to this party thinking you would have control over me. But you never understood true power, Mason. True power doesn't lie in humiliating or destroying someone. It lies in building something real. And you never understood that." Mason, speechless, simply stared at her. He felt the weight of defeat, but it was not just about losing money or power. It was about losing what he believed to be invulnerable, his own identity. Everything he thought was important crumbled before his eyes, and there was no one to save him this time. Clara and Julian walked away, leaving Mason, Luke, and Logan alone in the center of the room, surrounded by gazes that now judged them with the same coldness they once used against others. Julian and Clara made their way toward the exit of the mansion, leaving behind Mason and his friends crumbling in silence. The atmosphere around them felt frozen, as if no one had the courage to interrupt what had just transpired. But Clara knew this was not a victory she would celebrate. It was not a competition. What was at stake was not her image or pride, but something much greater, her dignity and her truth. Mason, Luke, and Logan had tried to destroy what she was, with a plan of humiliation that had turned against them. However, Clara knew that humiliation did not bring redemption. She always believed that true power lay in standing firm, regardless of the attacks, and walking away without carrying hatred in her heart. As they approached the door, Clara stopped and looked at Julian. "You knew what was going to happen to his family, didn't you?" Julian looked at her, his expression gentle but with the depth of someone who understood the weight of choices. "I did. The fate of his father's business was sealed long before I stepped in here today. I just hoped he would understand the lesson before it was too late." Clara sighed, reflecting on what had happened. "Maybe he will never understand. People like Mason live in a world of illusion, thinking that money is the only thing that defines them. I wish I could say he will change, but I don't know if that's possible." Julian nodded, thoughtful. "Sometimes, the fall is the only path to transformation. But change, Clara, is something each person must choose for themselves. We can't force it. We can only show the possible paths." Clara felt the weight of those words. The choice. That was the fundamental difference between her and Mason. She had chosen to live simply, even with access to luxury. She had opted to see the world beyond appearances, to find value in things he would never understand. while Mason, Luke, and Logan remained trapped in the cycle of power and ostentation, unable to perceive the emptiness that it carried. Outside, the fresh night air brought a sense of relief. Clara took a deep breath, feeling the lightness of being away from that suffocating atmosphere of falsehood and oppression. She and Julian walked toward the car, and before getting in, Clara paused once more, looking at the imposing mansion in the distance. "I could have been like them," Clara said, more to herself than to Julian. "I grew up surrounded by this world. I had every opportunity to become someone exactly like Mason, but I chose a different path." Julian watched her in silence for a moment, admiring the strength and clarity she carried within herself. "And that's exactly why you are where you are now. You chose to live beyond what others expected of you." Clara smiled faintly, but there was a melancholy in her eyes. She knew that, no matter how much she had chosen the path of authenticity, the echoes of the past still resonated. It wasn't easy to leave behind the weight of expectations that others placed on her shoulders. "Do you think he will ever understand?" "Mason, I mean." Julian shrugged. "That depends on him. Sometimes pain can open the eyes, but it can also blind them even more." They got into the car, and Clara looked out the window as Julian started the engine. The lights of the mansion shone in the distance, each one a reminder of everything she had left behind, of everything that could have been, but that she had wisely avoided. The silence in the car was comfortable, and Clara allowed herself to relax a little. But there was something that still troubled her. She wasn't completely at peace with what had happened. Not because she felt pity for Mason or the others, but because she knew that story was not over yet. Mason might have fallen at that moment, but what would come next was still to come. And somehow, Clara knew he wouldn't accept defeat easily. After a few minutes, Julian broke the silence. "You did the right thing tonight." Clara looked at him, surprised. "I just stood there, Julian. I didn't do anything." Julian shook his head, keeping his eyes on the road. "You did more than you realize. Your presence is what destroyed him, not what I did or said. He realized, looking at you, that he had lost. And that's the kind of defeat people like him cannot easily overcome." She reflected on this, but still felt that something was pending. "I know I did what was necessary, but part of me still wonders if, in some way, I went too far." Julian chuckled softly. "You think you went too far?" "Clara, you were the only one in that room who didn't lose control. You didn't confuse your dignity with their arrogance, and that's something they would never expect from you." Clara fell silent, allowing Julian's words to settle in. She knew he was right, but there was still a shadow of uncertainty in her heart. Perhaps not about what she had done, but about what would come next. Days passed since the party, and Clara's life seemed to move forward with tranquility. She continued to focus on her projects, and Julian, as always, maintained his firm and serene demeanor by her side. However, in the back of her mind, Clara knew that the story with Mason and his friends was not over. The humiliation he experienced that night, in front of so many influential people, would certainly not be easily forgotten. Mason was not the type to accept defeat without a fight. On the morning when Clara finally realized that her suspicions were correct, she woke up to several messages from acquaintances asking about rumors circulating about her. At that moment, she knew Mason had found a way to try to take revenge. The messages said that Clara was not who she appeared to be, insinuating that she had manipulated everyone, that she had dirty secrets hidden away. Sitting on the edge of her bed, Clara held her phone tightly, her hands trembling with indignation. Mason hadn't learned anything. He was trying to turn the situation around, attacking her from the shadows, spreading lies to undermine her reputation. It was a cowardly strategy, but predictable. And while Clara knew that it wouldn't hit her in the same way he desired, the scars of being unjustly defamed began to sting in her chest. Julian, noticing her silence that morning, approached her with a cup of coffee. He observed her for a few seconds, recognizing the whirlwind of emotions in her eyes. "What happened?" he asked, sitting down beside her. She sighed, handing him her phone to read the messages. "Mason, he's spreading rumors about me." Julian read carefully, his expression unchanged. "You knew he wouldn't let this go, didn't you?" Clara nodded slowly. "I knew. But he's going too far." "Yes," Julian replied calmly, placing the phone aside. "He is." Clara got up, pacing back and forth in the room. She felt the anger rising, but she knew she couldn't let it dominate her. Mason was trying to provoke her, trying to make her react impulsively. It was a power game, something she was already familiar with. She turned to Julian, her voice firm. "I'm not going to stoop to his level. I won't retaliate that way." Julian smiled, a look of pride on his face. "I knew you would say that." But Clara was not at peace. The words Mason was spreading might not have real power over her, but she knew the impact that could have on how others perceived her. There were those who believed everything they heard, who loved a scandal. And even being a strong and independent woman, Clara knew that dealing with these issues required more than just courage. "It's not fair," Clara said, her voice softer now. "I've built my life away from this kind of intrigue, this kind of malice. And now, he wants to destroy everything." Julian stood up and went to her, placing his hands on her shoulders. "You are bigger than this, Clara. Bigger than him. And you know that the truth always prevails." She looked at him, trying to absorb the calmness in his words. She knew Julian was right, but still, the hurt and anger boiled inside her. For a moment, she wondered if she should confront Mason directly, expose his lies publicly, show who he really was. But that would mean playing the same dirty game he was, and Clara knew that would diminish her. "He's destroying himself," Julian continued. "You saw what happened at that party. He lost everything there, and what he's doing now is just a desperate attempt to cling to something he no longer has." Clara nodded slowly. "I'm not going to let him destroy me, Julian. But I can't just stand by while he tries." Julian smiled again, with the calmness of someone who has faced much bigger battles. "Then don't stand still. But do it your way." Those words resonated with Clara. She knew she didn't need to stoop to Mason's level to put an end to this. Her path wasn't one of revenge or humiliation. She had something Mason would never have: integrity. And that, in the end, would be enough to silence any rumors, any attempts to take her down. That same afternoon, Clara decided she wouldn't allow the smear campaign to continue. She went to her closest contacts, influential people who knew her true story, and laid everything out clearly. There were no secrets, no games. She simply spoke the truth. And, as Julian had said, the truth had a power that Mason's lies could never reach. Over time, the people who truly mattered began to see Mason for what he was, a man destroyed by his own pride, desperate to maintain an image that no longer existed. His lies soon lost their strength, and his credibility slowly began to unravel. What had once been an act of revenge turned into a reflection of his own ruin. Clara, on the other hand, continued on her path, immune to Mason's attempts to drag her into his world of chaos. She had won, but not in the way he expected. The following weeks brought an unexpected calm. Mason seemed to have retreated, and the rumors he had spread faded as quickly as they had arisen. Clara, true to her decision not to react with hatred or revenge, felt that she had weathered the storm. Her confidence remained intact, as did her dignity. Still, deep down, a sense of unease lingered. She knew Mason wasn't the type to give up easily. The calm, as pleasant as it was, seemed only the prelude to something bigger. And this was confirmed one night when Clara received an unexpected call from Julian. His voice, usually calm, had a serious and firm tone. "Clara, we need to talk. Mason has done something that goes beyond rumors." Clara's heart raced. She knew Julian wouldn't alarm her without reason, and she immediately braced herself for what was to come. They met at a discreet cafe downtown, where Julian was already waiting with a grave expression. "He's trying to destroy your image in the financial market. He used some contacts to spread false information about your investments, trying to undermine the trust others have in you," he said bluntly. Clara felt a mix of indignation and exhaustion. It was as if Mason was willing to do anything to take her down, regardless of the consequences. "He's desperate," she remarked, trying to contain the whirlwind of emotions. "But can this really affect me?" "If we let it continue, yes," Julian replied. "As much as the lies have no basis, they can shake the confidence of investors and partners. Mason is playing dirty, and we know that in this kind of game, perception can be just as important as the truth." Clara was silent for a moment, absorbing the gravity of the situation. She had dealt with the rumors with dignity, but now the issue was more complex. Her work, her professional reputation, was under attack in a more dangerous way. Mason was willing to destroy whatever it took to compensate for his own downfall. "I'm not going to let him do this, Julian," Clara said finally. "But this time, I need to act more directly." Julian nodded, understanding the weight of Clara's decision. "I'm with you. Whatever you want to do, we'll face this together." And so they began to plan a way to expose Mason once and for all. Clara decided that the only way to end this would be to reveal the truth, but in a way that left no room for doubt or manipulation. Julian, with his contacts and influence, would help uncover Mason's shady connections, the fraudulent schemes he was involved in, and how he was trying to sabotage Clara through these webs of lies. In the days that followed, Clara and Julian worked tirelessly to piece everything together. It wouldn't be easy, but they knew that once the truth came to light, Mason would have nowhere left to run. The investigation revealed that Mason had used insider information to sabotage not only Clara, but other people and companies as well. His desperation led him to make dangerous decisions, and now everything was about to come crashing down. On the day marked for the big reveal, Clara sat next to Julian at a press conference organized for important investors. With a firm posture, she waited for the right moment to speak. When she finally took the microphone, her voice echoed with serenity and strength. "In recent months, I have been the target of sabotage attempts that go beyond personal attacks. Today, I bring to light the truth about these actions and the person responsible for them. I am not here to defend myself because the truth speaks for itself. I am here to protect everything I have built and to expose what has been happening behind the scenes." With compelling evidence in hand, Clara unmasked Mason in front of everyone present. The documents that exposed his fraudulent schemes and attempts to manipulate the financial market were clear, and there was no denying the truth. Julian, always by her side, ensured that all the information was validated by experts, leaving Mason with no room to evade responsibility. The repercussions were immediate. Mason's name, once associated with power and prestige, quickly became synonymous with fraud and dishonesty. His family, already facing financial difficulties, was now completely discredited in the business world. Mason, cornered and without an escape, disappeared from public life, unable to cope with the consequences of his actions. Clara, on the other hand, emerged stronger than ever. The truth freed her from any shadow that Mason might have tried to cast over her, and her reputation was not only restored, but elevated. She had faced the storm and come out victorious, without losing her integrity in the process. After the event, Clara and Julian met at a quiet restaurant to celebrate the end of that long battle. As they toasted in silence, she looked at him with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, Julian." He smiled sincerely. "You would have made it, Clara. All I did was stand by your side. The strength has always been in you." Clara reflected for a moment, feeling the truth in Julian's words. Mason had tried to destroy her in every possible way, but in the end, it was he who destroyed himself. She, on the other hand, had remained true to who she was, without letting hatred or revenge consume her heart. At the end of that night, as Clara walked alone through the quiet streets, she took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything she had been through dissipate. There was pain, yes, and exhaustion, but there was also a peace she had never experienced before. She had chosen her paths wisely, and now she was ready to move forward, without looking back. We hope you enjoyed this narrative. Please help by leaving your like and subscribing to the channel so you won't miss more emotional stories that touch the soul. Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments. We would love to know what you think, and both thanks and critiques are welcome. See you in the next exciting video. Until then.